Hello again, welcome back to the channel. Today's video will be another story time. I believe I said last time it would be about how I got into horror fiction or something along those lines, and so that's what I'm going to do. Well, when I was a kid, I liked Dr. Seuss books when I was a young kid. But as I got older, obviously I moved into different books. And the first books I really remember reading were Goosebumps from R.L. Stine. I'm sure most of you guys know that. So yeah, those were probably my first intro into any kind of horror fiction at all. And also remember reading some westerns by like Louis L'Amour, and those were really good. Anyway, I kind of got out of reading things for a little while after that, but I remember as a kid, my dad was reading Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, and I was intrigued by it because it had the artwork inside of it, and I would sit down on the floor and, flip through the pages and look at the artwork, and I was just mesmerized by the artwork and the imagery that it made my imagination really kick into overdrive. And every so often I'd go back and look at them again, even into my early teen years. But anyway, I really didn't read a whole lot as a teenager, a little. But the first thing I really remember reading and being really into was the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And it was after the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, and I wanted to know what happened, and I didn't want to wait on the next movies to come out because I knew it would be a long time. So I went ahead and read The Hobbit and the first book, second book, third book, and I really enjoyed them. And then that really got me into a fantasy kick, and I wrote a fantasy story that's actually multiple books long and not completed yet, but that's another story. Pun not intended. But let's see, what was it? Oh yeah. So I went in. That got me into fantasy, and I really started looking for other things. And I found some things I really liked, and I found some things I didn't like so much. After a while, fantasy kind of, I wouldn't say it got old. Really what happened was I was reading fantasy stuff, and I finally decided that I would read Stephen King's The Dark Tower. After all those years as a kid flipping through those pages and seeing that artwork, finally decided to read it. And probably, to be honest with you, those 7, now 8 books, probably my favorite story combined of all time. It's just awesome. Say what you want about the ending or whatever, but that story is magnificent. Anyway, that was a great story because I've always liked horror, and I was really liking fantasy. And not necessarily just horror stories or fantasy stories, but horror and fantasy in general. And so that one melded the two together, and it was just excellent. And really, though, to be honest, that book series pushed me more away from fantasy and more towards horror. And I started writing horror books, and I started reading more Stephen King scaries. It and Salem's Lot, and just The Shining, and all of those kinds of things. But anyway, that's really how I got into horror. And I'd always been a creative writer, or liked to creative write anyway. It always had come kind of easy for me. And so after reading through, I was reading the fantasy stuff, and I wrote the fantasy stories, started reading more horror stuff, and started writing horror stories. And I really enjoy writing horror stories, so I still do. Anyway, yeah, that's kind of how I got into horror. I got to thank my dad for having those Stephen King books around, and got to thank Stephen King. And I don't know the authors' names or the illustrators' names off the top of my head, but the men that, I think they were all men. I don't think there were any women, but anyway, the people that put the artwork in those books, I got to thank them too, because man, they really captured my imagination. All right, guys, I'll talk to you later.